Picture this. It's 2007. The setting is Hamburg, Germany.
Right, the absolute peak of the boom.
Exactly. The flashbulbs are popping. The European financial press is all gathered in this opulent room. And standing at the center of it all is the late Tulsi Tanti, the visionary founder of Suzlon Energy.
And he's about to make a massive announcement.
A huge one.
Yeah.
He's there to announce something that, at the time, felt almost unthinkable for an emerging markets company. This relatively young Indian wind energy firm is acquiring Repower Systems.
Which was a very serious, deeply established European turbine maker.
Yeah, and they bought them for roughly 1.2 billion euros. I mean, Tanti's projecting this incredible aura of absolute invincibility in that room. The message he was sending to the global markets was unmistakable. Geography just doesn't matter anymore.
Right. He was saying, we're not just an Indian company, we're a global player.
Exactly. Suzlon was going to be this sprawling global wind energy conglomerate, and they were going to plant flags wherever the wind blew. Now, that specific Hamburg photo is actually the opening scene of a massive, incredibly timely piece of analysis published just today, May 28, 2026.
Oh, fantastic piece.
It really is. It's by the financial newsletter Equity Decoded by Spirit. The article is titled Suzlon, the company that died twice and is still standing. And let me tell you, it is a wild ride. So welcome to a brand new deep dive. We are taking that deep, detailed analysis and pulling it apart today.
It really is the perfect starting point because that Hamburg press conference encapsulates the absolute peak of an era of unfettered corporate ambition.
Oh, absolutely.
You had an Indian manufacturing company not just buying European engineering, but attempting to completely backward integrate its supply chain. I mean, they wanted to own the generator manufacturing. They wanted to own the gearbox engineering.
They wanted the whole pie.
Exactly. They were essentially trying to conquer the entire global supply chain of wind energy in one massive debt-fueled swoop.
But if we fast forward to today, that image feels like a dispatch from an alternate timeline. We are looking at the dramatic rise, the frankly catastrophic fall, and the highly improbable resurrection of that exact same company.
The turnaround is just, it's unbelievable.
It is. And our mission for this deep dive is to decode the actual physical mechanics of the wind energy business. We want to understand how a company that was literally buried under a mountain of structural debt successfully restructures its way back to a net cash position.
Which is incredibly rare in heavy manufacturing.
Right. And crucially, we need to learn how to look past those flashy headline valuation numbers that scream across stock screeners to see what is actually keeping the financial engine running under the hood.
Yeah, because the market is notoriously terrible at pricing in the mechanics of a turnaround, especially in heavy infrastructure.
Oh, totally.
Investors tend to look at trailing metrics that are completely distorted by past trauma, or they get overly excited by one-time accounting adjustments. To understand Suzlon today, you really have to understand the specific anatomy of the debt they shed and the physical reality of the machines they build.
So for you listening right now, whether you are actively researching renewable energy investments, trying to wrap your head around the sheer scale of India's infrastructure boom, or if you just want to hone your ability to spot a genuine operational turnaround versus a temporary accounting mirage, this deep dive is going to arm you with the tools to read the market like a pro. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Let's stay in that 2007 era for a moment, what the source aptly calls the Icarus era. They buy Repower for 1.2 billion euros. And around the same time, they also buy Belgium's Hansen transmissions.
Right, chasing that total vertical integration.
Yeah, the strategy was total ownership. But they flew way too close to the sun. The source details the unwinding selling Hansen in 2011 to ZF Friedrichshafen and finally letting go of Repower in 2015.
It's Centerbridge Partners, yeah.
Right. So why did this grand strategy fail so spectacularly?
Well, it comes down to the fundamental incompatibility between a highly cyclical industry and a highly leveraged fixed cost structure.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
So when you attempt that level of aggressive vertical integration, buying up the sprawling European factories that make your gearboxes, owning the massive foundries for your generators, you are making a concentrated, irreversible bet on perpetual, uninterrupted macroeconomic growth.
You're assuming the music never stops.
Exactly. The thesis is that if you own the supplier, you capture the supplier's profit margin at every step of the value chain.
It makes me think of an analogy. It's like buying an entire dairy farm just because you drink a lot of milk and you want to save money on the grocery store markup.
That's actually a great way to put it.
Right, like it's brilliant math when you're drinking gallons of it a day and milk prices are soaring. But then suddenly the macro environment changes. Maybe you go lactose intolerant, or there's a massive global milk surplus. You suddenly realize, wait a minute, I still have to feed all these cows.
Yes, the cows don't care about the market demand.
Exactly. The cows don't care that the market demand shifted. They still require feed, veterinary care, and housing every single day.
That is the perfect visualization of heavy manufacturing overhead. Empty factories in Belgium and Germany were Suzlon's hungry cows. They bleed cash at a terrifying rate.
And you can't just turn them off.
No, you can't. The maintenance of the heavy machinery, the salaries of highly specialized European engineering staff, and crucially, the massive debt servicing on the very loans you took out to buy those factories in the first place. None of that pauses just because the 2008 global financial crisis hits and turbine orders suddenly dry up.
I push back on the idea that this was entirely just unforeseeable bad luck, though. Like, was this massive global push just pure hubris on Tulsi Tanti's part, assuming the good times would never end? Or did the global market conditions genuinely shift beneath their feet in a way that even conservative models couldn't have predicted?
I would argue it's a potent mix of both, honestly. A mix of visionary ambition colliding with a true black swan macroeconomic event. There was undeniably a fierce desire to elevate an Indian manufacturing firm to the top tier of the global stage, to compete directly with Vestas and GE.
Right, to be the biggest.
But that ambition was fundamentally underwritten by an assumption of continuous cheap global capital and an uninterrupted trajectory of renewable energy adoption in the West. When the 2008 crisis hit, followed closely by the European sovereign debt crises, project finance completely froze.
And the money just evaporated.
The structural flaw wasn't the ambition to go global, though. The fatal flaw was financing long-term, illiquid, highly cyclical physical assets with a capital structure that demanded immediate, massive debt servicing. They had zero shock absorbers when the cycle turned.
So the unwinding wasn't strategic. It was a desperate fight for survival. By 2013, they are trapped in the corporate debt restructuring mechanism. They are forced to systematically liquidate the European empire just to appease a consortium of anxious creditors.
Yeah, they had to strip the house down to the absolute studs.
Right, and retreat back to their roots, building Indian wind turbines for Indian developers. And this shift back to the domestic physical product is a great place to anchor ourselves. Because before I read this analysis, my mental model of a wind turbine was, frankly, a bit embarrassing.
Let me guess, a giant white pinwheel on a hill.
Exactly, just a simple pinwheel. But to grasp why Suzlon's financials behave the way they do, we have to respect the sheer physical brutality of manufacturing these machines.
You absolutely have to respect the engineering reality because you cannot divorce the balance sheet from the factory floor in this sector. On a spreadsheet, they just deliver wind turbine generators. But up close, a modern megawatt-scale turbine is a gargantuan feat of industrial coordination.
It's massive.
You are managing three distinct, incredibly complex supply chains that all have to converge perfectly on a remote patch of land.
Let's walk through those three distinct pieces, because it's fascinating.
Sure. First, you have the aerodynamic components, the blades. These are massive, highly engineered fiberglass composite structures, often stretching 50 to 60 meters long or more.
Which is just huge.
It is. They require pristine manufacturing conditions and complex resin infusions to ensure they don't shatter under the immense aerodynamic stress of a storm. Second, you have the structural foundation, the steel tubular tower.
And this isn't just a basic pole, right?
Far from it. It's a massive multi-section steel structure that has to be incredibly resilient to support the oscillating weight at the top, all while withstanding extreme environmental conditions over a 20-year lifespan.
And the third piece, which the source material specifically calls a mechanical nightmare, is the nacelle.
Well, the nacelle is the brain and the muscle. It is essentially a bus-sized industrial housing sitting at the very top of that steel tower. Inside, you have the electrical generator, the yaw mechanisms to face the wind, and the gearbox.
I really want to linger on the gearbox, because it seems to be the central point of failure and cost in a lot of these older turbine designs. Why is it so complicated? Like, if the wind spins the blades and the blades are attached to a generator, why do you need this massive intermediary box of gears?
Well, it comes down to the physics of wind power versus the physics of electricity generation. Wind naturally turns those massive, heavy fiberglass blades relatively slowly, maybe 10 to 15 revolutions per minute.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the generator inside the nacelle needs high-speed rotation, often over 1,500 revolutions per minute, to cross the magnetic fields and efficiently produce grid-quality electricity.
Oh, wow. That's a massive difference.
It is. So the gearbox's entire job is to take that sluggish, incredibly high torque spin from the rotor shaft and forcefully, mechanically, whip it up into a rapid high-speed rotation.
That sounds like it puts a terrifying amount of stress on the metal.
It is an environment of extreme, constant metallurgical violence. You have massive torque spikes when a gust of wind hits, meaning the gears are subjected to incredible grinding forces.
It just sounds like a recipe for constant breakdowns.
It requires precision metallurgy, microscopic tolerances, and constant, flawless lubrication systems. And think about this. If a gearbox fails 100 meters in the air, you need massive specialized cranes just to get it down to repair it. It is a highly expensive, highly complex bottleneck in the supply chain.
So coordinating all of this, the fiberglass, the raw steel, the precision metallurgy translates into a very brutal financial reality for Suzlon's primary business of turbine delivery. The source notes this isn't a business where you build something, put it on a shelf, and get paid at the cash register.
Oh, not at all. It is an absolute slog of a working capital cycle. From the moment Suzlon signs a contract with the developer, it typically takes 12 to 18 months before they can actually book the final revenue and walk away.
Because they're fronting the cash for the raw materials long before the turbine is actually generating electricity. I'm imagining the cash flow statement here. Day 1, the contract is signed. Day 30, Suzlon is sending millions of rupees out the door to buy raw steel and fiberglass resin.
And that cash is just gone, sitting in inventory.
Exactly. Month 6, they are paying logistics companies to move these massive components down narrow rural highways. They only get paid in tranches based on hitting very specific construction milestones.
That's the harsh reality of project-based manufacturing. You are tying up an enormous amount of your own working capital for quarters at a time. If there is a delay in land acquisition or a delay in pouring the concrete foundation at the site, your massive fiberglass blades sit in the storage yard and your milestone payment is delayed.
So you're just bleeding.
Yeah, it is an incredibly cash-heavy, low-margin ordeal because there are so many variables completely outside of your direct control.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The source points out that this grueling 12 to 18-month manufacturing slog is only half the business. There is a second, completely different business hiding inside Suzlon that completely changes the math, and it's the part that traditional financial analysts often get totally wrong.
You're talking about the operations and maintenance side of the house.
Yes.
The O&M business.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. What's fascinating here is how blending the financials of the manufacturing side with the O&M side obscures one of the highest quality recurring revenue streams in the entire renewable energy sector.
Let's break down why analysts get this wrong. Because a lazy analysis just looks at Suzlon's total revenue, looks at their total profit, and slaps a single blended profit margin on the entire company. Why is that a trap?
Because it treats two fundamentally different economic engines as if they are one machine. When Suzlon successfully survives that 18-month slog, plants a turbine in the ground, and commissions it for a developer, they don't just hand over the keys and walk away.
Right.
They almost universally lock in an operations and maintenance contract to service that exact machine for its entire operational lifespan, which is typically 15 to 20 years.
So every time they sell a turbine, they are inherently selling a 2-decade subscription service attached to it.
Precisely. The heavy manufacturing side is volatile, cash-draining, and subject to brutal supply chain shocks. The O&M business, by contrast, is predictable, asset-light, and carries significantly fatter profit margins.
Because you're just maintaining it.
Exactly. You are sending out specialized crews in trucks to change oil, check sensors, and perform preventative maintenance. You aren't buying raw steel anymore. And most importantly, this O&M revenue organically scales up and stacks on top of itself every single year as the installed base grows.
The numbers on this are staggering. The source notes Suzlon is sitting on an O&M footprint of over 20,000 megawatts of cumulative capacity.
Think about the logistical scale of that moat. They are actively monitoring, servicing, and repairing 20,000 megawatts of heavy machinery spread across some of the most remote and windswept areas of India.
It's unbelievable scale.
That massive fleet generates a river of steady, highly reliable cash flow every single quarter, regardless of the broader economic cycle.
It acts as a massive financial shock absorber. Like, even if inflation spikes or a new government delays wind options for 6 months and Suzlon's new turbine sales temporarily flatline, that 20,000 megawatt O&M book is still throwing off enough cash to keep the lights on, pay the corporate staff, and service the baseline obligations.
It is the absolute hidden gem of the balance sheet. And it's why you have to mentally separate the company into the cash-draining growth engine of turbine sales and the cash-printing stability engine of O&M.
Okay, so we understand the physical reality. We understand the grueling working capital cycle of the supply chain and the recurring beauty of O&M. But for years, having this massive, vertically integrated manufacturing footprint entirely inside India was actually seen as a vulnerability, right? Because the global market was flooding with cheaper parts.
It was a massive strategic disadvantage in a
Hmm.
purely free trade environment, yeah. If you were Suzlon, carrying the heavy fixed costs of domestic foundries and blade factories, and a competitor like Vestas or GE Vernova can simply import cheaper, heavily subsidized components from massive global supply chains, often out of China, you're going to get slaughtered on pricing.
You just can't compete in government auctions.
Exactly. You simply can't match their cost basis.
But then, the chessboard completely flips. The source highlights a regulatory move in July 2025 that altered the entire trajectory of the domestic wind industry, the ALMM policy.
The approved list of models and manufacturers. If you want to understand the competitive dynamics of Indian renewables today, you have to understand the ALMM. It is essentially a hardline government mandate regarding local sourcing and supply chain security.
Walk us through how this mandate actually works in practice. How does the government enforce it without just grinding the entire energy transition to a halt?
The mechanism is actually quite elegant in its strictness. The government dictates that if a renewable energy developer wants to build a wind project that is connected to the central grid or backed by government power purchase agreements, which constitutes the vast, overwhelming majority of utility-scale projects in India, they are legally required to buy their turbines from manufacturers who have been certified and placed on this ALM list.
And the only way onto the VIP list is to build the parts inside India.
Exactly. You have to prove stringent adherence to domestic content requirements. You cannot just import a finished nacelle from Shenzhen, slap a logo on it, and bid for a government project.
I see the math on that, but I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. If India is desperate to hit 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030, which is an insanely aggressive target,
Yeah.
why would they intentionally block the cheapest, fastest equipment from entering the country? Isn't the ALMM policy essentially the government shooting its own climate goals in the foot just to protect local jobs?
That is the exact tension that policymakers wrestled with. It is a trade-off between the speed of deployment and long-term sovereign security. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Indian government looked at the global geopolitical landscape, particularly the West's sudden, painful realization of their reliance on Russian natural gas or Europe's near-total dependence on Chinese solar panels, and they made a strategic calculus.
Right, they saw the risk.
Energy security is national security. You cannot transition your entire economy to run on renewable electrons and leave the physical manufacturing of the machines that generate those electrons to a geopolitical rival. The government is willing to accept slightly higher upfront capital costs and perhaps a slightly slower rollout in the immediate near term to force the creation of a robust, self-sufficient domestic manufacturing ecosystem.
So overnight, this policy takes Suzlon's biggest liability, their heavy, expensive, domestically trapped manufacturing footprint, and turns it into an impenetrable government-mandated moat. They didn't have to scramble to meet the ALMM requirements because they had already spent a decade building the domestic supply chain just to survive.
It was a stroke of profound regulatory luck that perfectly matched their existing operational reality. Meanwhile, the foreign rivals hit a brick wall. Global giants who historically utilized a very light-touch assembly model in India, leaning heavily on imported global parts, were suddenly locked out of the most lucrative auction pipelines.
The source mentions Siemens Gamesa specifically having a notoriously messy history in India.
Siemens Gamesa is a classic example of the difficulty of the Indian market. They've had periods of aggressive entry, followed by struggles with local execution, sudden pullbacks, and attempts to re-enter. It is a market that punishes half measures.
You can't just dip your toe in.
No, you either commit billions of rupees to building a deep, localized vendor ecosystem over years, or policies like the ALMM will instantly render you uncompetitive.
So the foreign threat is largely neutralized by the government. But Suzlon isn't operating in a domestic monopoly. The source points out a very real, very aggressive domestic challenger, Inox Wind. And I want to dig into this because Inox isn't just a plucky underdog. They are actively stealing market share.
Inox Wind is absolutely the most serious immediate threat to Suzlon's dominance. They are a smaller, highly agile player, and they are executing on their order book with remarkable aggression. They've been particularly successful at grabbing market share in premium, high-wind states like Rajasthan and Gujarat.
But the source highlights that Inok's biggest weapon isn't a better turbine blade or a faster gearbox. It's their capital structure. How did Inox get such a structural advantage over Suzlon?
It comes down to timing and historical baggage. Inox did not embark on a debt-fueled global acquisition spree in 2007. They didn't buy European factories right before a global financial crisis.
So they skipped the trauma.
Precisely. Because they avoided the initial trauma that forced Suzlon into a decade of brutal debt restructuring, Inox operates today with a much cleaner, sharper balance sheet. They don't have the ghosts of past corporate debt restructuring mechanisms haunting their capital allocation.
Which means when Inox bids against Suzlon for a massive project in Gujarat, Inox can afford to offer a slightly lower price because they aren't secretly siphoning off a portion of their profit margin just to service legacy debt from a decade ago.
Exactly. A clean balance sheet allows for aggressive pricing and faster capacity expansion. Inox is a genuine top-tier competitor that Suzlon's management has to deeply respect.
However, the article makes a fascinating pivot here that completely reframes the competitive landscape. It argues that if you spend all your time analyzing Suzlon versus Inox, or Suzlon versus Vestas, you are entirely missing the actual war. The ultimate boss fight in this industry isn't one wind company against another, it's wind energy versus solar energy.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where the sheer mind-bending scale of the Indian renewable market comes into focus. Wind and solar are theoretically complementary, but in reality, they are fighting for the exact same finite resources.
The same land, the same grid connections.
The same government auction pipelines, the same congested transmission corridors, and the exact same capital allocations from the mega buyers.
Let's look at the scoreboard as of August 2025 because the numbers are stark. India had pushed its solar capacity past 123 gigawatts. The source notes that is an absurd 42 times larger than it was just back in 2014, 123 gigawatts of solar. Meanwhile, the total cumulative wind capacity was sitting at just 52.68 gigawatts.
Solar is absolutely routing wind in terms of sheer deployment speed.
Why is solar so dominant?
The economics and logistics of solar are overwhelmingly compelling. Solar is simply cheaper to manufacture at scale. It is drastically simpler to transport. You can pack hundreds of panels into a standard shipping container.
Instead of a 60-meter blade on a specialized truck.
Exactly. And it is vastly faster to deploy and install. You don't need specialized metallurgy, you don't need massive cranes, and you don't need to navigate mountain roads. You acquire flat land, you pound the mounting racks into the dirt, and you plug the panels in. It is highly modular and predictable.
Which begs the obvious question, if solar is cheaper, faster, and easier, why bother with wind at all? Why doesn't the Indian government just save the logistical headache and aim for a 100% solar grid?
Because of the fatal, unavoidable flaw of solar power, the duck curve. Solar has a massive daily generation drop-off. You get this colossal, sometimes grid-overwhelming spike of energy generation in the middle of the day when the sun is highest.
Right, but then the sun sets.
But the moment the sun goes down in the evening, solar generation plummets to absolute zero. And unfortunately, that evening period is exactly when residential energy demand peaks as people return home, turn on lights, and crank up their air conditioning.
So you have a massive mismatch between when the power is made and when the power is actually needed.
Exactly. And this is where the physical characteristics of wind become indispensable. Wind boasts significantly better capacity factors in premium locations. More importantly, wind blows at night. It blows fiercely during the monsoon season, when heavy cloud cover completely kills solar efficiency.
So they balance each other out.
Wind perfectly fills the daily and seasonal voids left by solar power. If India wants to maintain a stable baseload grid without relying on coal, they absolutely need a massive expansion of wind to balance the solar volatility.
Okay, so the macroeconomic need for wind is solid, but we need to look at who is actually buying these turbines, because Suzlon isn't selling these machines to homeowners. They're selling to what the source calls the mega buyers.
The consolidation of independent power producers in India has created entities of staggering scale. We are talking about heavyweights like Adani Green, To give you a sense of their velocity, the source mentions Adani Green crossed 19.3 gigawatts of total operational capacity in FY26.
And wait, they added 5 gigawatts of that capacity in a single year? That is a mind-boggling amount of infrastructure to procure and deploy in just 12 months.
It is unprecedented scale. You also have massive state-backed players like NTPC Renewables and aggressive private players like Torrent Power. These are the titans buying Suzlon's output.
But wait, I have to challenge the economics of this customer dynamic. If you operate in a market where your customer base is highly consolidated into an oligopsony, just a handful of absolute titans like Adani and NTPC, doesn't that give those buyers terrifying negotiating leverage over Suzlon? I mean, if Adani Green comes to Suzlon and says, we want 2 gigawatts of turbines, but you are going to drop your price by 15% or we walk, what does Suzlon do? They can't afford to lose a 2-gigawatt order.
You've correctly identified the core tension of this market structure. When times are good, having a concentrated group of mega buyers gives a manufacturer like Suzlon amazing operational predictability. You secure 1 or 2 massive contracts, and your entire factory order book is locked in for the next 18 months.
Which is great.
But you are absolutely right. When the macroeconomic environment tightens, those mega buyers possess brutal negotiating leverage to squeeze supplier margins.
So how does Suzlon survive that squeeze? What stops Adani or NTPC from negotiating Suzlon's profit margins down to zero?
2 crucial defensive layers. First, sheer market dominance. Suzlon currently commands over 55% of the cumulative domestic wind market. When you control more than half of the entire nation's capacity, you inherently possess a degree of pricing power simply because the mega buyers physically need your manufacturing throughput.
They just don't have enough other options.
Even if Inox Wind is running their factories at 100% capacity, there simply aren't enough other domestic suppliers to fulfill the massive deployment targets of companies like Adani. They literally cannot hit their growth goals without Suzlon's turbines.
And the second defensive layer.
This is where that ALMM policy becomes the ultimate shield. Before the government enacted the ALMM, a mega buyer could easily say to Suzlon, lower your price or we will just buy cheap imported turbines from Europe or China. They had a credible fallback threat.
Oh, wow.
The ALMM completely evaporated that threat. It heavily tilted the negotiating math back in Suzlon's favor. The mega buyer is legally mandated to source locally to get their projects approved, and Suzlon is the dominant local player standing at the toll gate.
That is a fascinating interplay between government regulation and corporate strategy. Okay, so the operational mechanics make sense. They have the market share, they have the ALMM moat protecting them, they have the O&M business printing recurring cash, and the grid desperately needs wind to balance the solar duck curve. On paper, the business model is finally sound. But this is the critical juncture for anyone listening who wants to evaluate Suzlon as an investment. We have to look under the hood at the actual financials. We have to talk about how they survived the debt.
The debt restructuring is arguably the most famous part of Suzlon's modern history, but it is also the most frequently misunderstood by retail investors.
Let's walk through the raw numbers first, because the sheer scale of the drop is staggering. In FY20, Suzlon was suffocating under roughly 13,210 crore rupees of net debt.
A completely unsustainable figure that was actively cannibalizing the company from the inside out.
Right. Every rupee of operating profit was being fed right into the furnace of interest payments. And then by FY25, that net debt figure dropped to just 323 crore rupees. And if you fast forward to December 2025, they had miraculously swung to a positive net cash position of 1,556 crore rupees. If you just look at that line graph, it looks like magic.
It looks like a miraculous V-shaped recovery. But staring at that plunge on a chart does not actually tell you the brutal reality of how they pulled it off. And if you don't understand the specific financial mechanics of how that debt disappeared, you fundamentally misunderstand the risk profile of the equity you are looking at today.
The source calls it a messy mix of deleveraging. I want us to break that down deeply, because it wasn't just them selling a bunch of turbines, saving up their profits, and politely paying off the bank loans over time.
Far from it. Fixing a balance sheet that deeply damaged required taking an absolute sledgehammer to the corporate structure. It was a triage operation that involved 3 distinct, painful buckets of action.
Walk us through the first bucket.
The first bucket was extreme financial restructuring and massive equity dilution. We are talking about 2 grueling rounds of corporate debt restructuring with their consortium of lenders. To appease the banks and avoid total liquidation, Suzlon had to heavily dilute the existing equity base. They issued massive amounts of new shares through qualified institutional placements, or QIPs, and major rights issues.
Let me pause and explain the mechanics of that for anyone who isn't steeped in corporate finance. If a company issues a massive wave of new shares to raise cash to pay off debt, they are essentially slicing the ownership pie of the company into thousands of smaller pieces. The total debt of the company goes down, which saves the company from bankruptcy, but your individual piece of the company just got much, much smaller. Your ownership was diluted.
Exactly. It is a necessary mechanism for survival, but it is highly punitive to the existing long-term shareholders who held on through the crash. Their claim on future earnings is permanently reduced. And the dilution didn't stop at QIPs. They also utilized optionally convertible debentures, or OCDs.
Okay, optional convertible debentures. I know a debenture is essentially a corporate bond or a loan. What is the option part, and how does it clear debt?
An OCD is an instrument issued to a creditor that gives them a choice. They can hold it like traditional debt and collect interest and eventually get their principal back. Or they have the option to convert that debt into equity, actual shares of the company, at a predetermined price.
Ah, I see.
When Suzlon was in deep distress, creditors frequently opted to convert these debentures into equity, essentially trading the company's debt for ownership stakes. This magically wipes the debt liability off the balance sheet. But again, it floods the market with new shares, compounding the dilution for retail investors.
So the first bucket was essentially printing new shares to make the debt vanish at the cost of massive dilution. What was the second bucket?
The second bucket was the painful liquidation of the global empire. They stripped the house down to the studs. They sold off all those prized historical assets we discussed earlier, Hanson Transmissions, Repower. They liquidated the family silver, bringing in whatever cash they could to rapidly pay down the principal balances on their most expensive loans.
And the third bucket? Because you can't just shrink your way to a healthy business forever.
The third bucket is the only one that actually matters for the future valuation of the company operational cash flow. As the Indian wind market slowly woke up from its slumber, and as Suzlon cleared away the massive distractions of their failing European subsidiaries, they finally started generating real, tangible operating cash from executing on their backlog of domestic turbine orders and their O&M contracts.
So the 13,000 crore debt disappeared through a combination of heavily diluting the shareholders, selling off every non-core asset they could find, and finally, actually running a profitable domestic business.
Yes. And the critical takeaway for investors is that the first two buckets are empty now. Going forward, they can't rely on selling Repower again because it's gone. They can't rely on printing endless new shares to solve problems without completely destroying their stock price. The entire game from this point forward rests purely on the third bucket. Can they keep piling up cash purely from running the physical business?
And according to the latest numbers, that third bucket is overflowing. Let's look at their Q4 FY26 results. They brought in 5,468 crore rupees in revenue and walked away with 11,114 crore in profit after tax. For the full year, net profit sale passed the 3,100 crore mark. As the author notes, you cannot fake cash generation at that scale. The underlying business is humming.
It really is.
But this brings us to a massive screaming valuation trap for retail investors. And I want to highlight this clearly because if you just pull up Suzlon on a standard stock screener like Yahoo Finance, you are going to see a metric that will probably scare you away if you don't understand the mechanics of this turnaround.
You are referring to the price-to-earnings ratio, the PE multiple.
Exactly. At a stock price of around 57 rupees a share, the screeners are showing Suzlon trading at roughly a 24x trailing PE ratio. To a traditional deep value investor, or someone looking for a cheap turnaround play, 24 times earnings looks expensive. It looks like the turnaround is already fully priced in. But the source argues forcefully that looking at the PE ratio here is utterly useless. Why is it a broken metric in this specific case?
Because the trailing PE ratio is completely distorted by the ghost of their past debt. To understand why, you have to think about how earnings per share, the denominator in the PE ratio, is actually calculated. Earnings are what remains after you take your operating profit and subtract your taxes, depreciation, and critically your interest expenses.
Right.
For years, Suzlon was lugging around that suffocating 13,000 plus crore debt load. That meant they were contractually obligated to pay enormous crippling interest expenses to the banks every single quarter.
The source gives a brilliant, simple example of this math. Imagine the core business is healthy. The factories generate 200 crore in operating profit. But because of the legacy debt, you have to write a check to the bank for 800 crore in interest payments that quarter. On paper, you report a massive net loss of 600 crore.
Exactly. The actual physical business of making, selling, and servicing turbines wasn't necessarily failing. The factories were working, the O&M teams were out in the field, but the capital structure draped over the company was completely broken, dragging the final earnings number into the abyss.
So what happens mechanically to the earnings now that the debt is gone?
Now that they have deleveraged all the way down to a net cash position, that massive quarterly interest burden has completely vanished. And when a massive fixed expense like interest disappears, your final earnings per share automatically expand rapidly, even if your underlying factory operating profit doesn't budge an inch.
Oh, it just springs up.
It is an accounting uncoiling. Therefore, looking at a trailing PE multiple, which still includes quarters where earnings were heavily suppressed by interest payments, tells you absolutely nothing about the actual unburdened cash generation power of the company today.
Okay, so if PE is a useless metric for a freshly deleveraged company, what metric should an investor actually be looking at to gauge if the stock is cheap or expensive?
If you want an honest, clean valuation metric that strips out capital structure noise, you should look at EV to EBITDA enterprise value to earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization.
Break down why EV to EBITDA tells a truer story here.
Enterprise value is a more comprehensive measure of a company's total value than just market cap because it factors in debt and cash. The formula is market cap plus debt minus cash. Because Suzlon is now sitting on a net cash pile of over 1,500 crore, their enterprise value is actually lower than their headline market cap.
Right, the cash offsets the value.
When you take that lower enterprise value and weigh it against EBITDA, which measures purely the operational profitability before the ghosts of interest and taxes get involved, the valuation multiple compresses significantly. It makes the stock look much more reasonably priced than the PE implies. In the third quarter of FY26, they posted an EBITDA of 739 crore on 4,228 crore in revenue.
Which translates to a very healthy operational profit margin of about 17.5%.
Exactly. If you annualize that 17.5% operational performance and weigh it against their net cash enterprise value, the investment picture is much more compelling than a screener's PE ratio suggests.
But the author warns about a second massive trap hidden in the financials, and this one catches momentum traders all the time. In the second quarter of FY26, Suzlon reported an absolutely mind-blowing 539% jump in year-over-year net profit.
Oh yeah, that headline was everywhere.
If you're a retail trader scanning morning news headlines, you see Suzlon profit jumps 539% and you instinctively hit the buy button, assuming they just sold an unprecedented mountain of wind turbines. But that headline was an illusion, wasn't it?
It was a massive, perfectly legal accounting illusion. The vast majority of that 539% profit spike did not come from factory operations. It came from the activation of a deferred tax asset.
What is a deferred tax asset, and how does it magically create profit?
It is a fascinating quirk of corporate accounting. During all those dark years when Suzlon was bleeding cash and taking massive net losses, the tax code recognized those losses. They were essentially accumulating tax credits book entries that they could use to offset their future tax bills, provided they ever became profitable again.
Okay.
But accounting rules dictate you can only recognize these assets on your balance sheet if you have a reasonable certainty of actually making enough future profit to use them.
So for years, they had these tax coupons sitting in a drawer, but their auditors wouldn't let them count them because nobody believed Suzlon would survive long enough to use them.
Precisely. Fast forward to Q2 of FY26. The debt is gone, the company's undeniably profitable, and the auditors finally agree, yes, you're going to survive. So in one single quarter, Suzlon executed a one-time accounting move to recognize 640 crore rupees of those past tax assets on their balance sheet. Wow. The 640 crore instantly flows through the income statement and massively pads the net profit number for that specific quarter.
So it wasn't a bunch of new turbine deliveries. It was an accountant finally moving a massive number from a hidden drawer into the active ledger.
Yes. It is a genuine financial benefit. They won't have to pay cash taxes on a portion of future earnings. But it is an accounting quirk, not a repeating cash engine. If you strip out that one-time 640 crore tax asset recognition, their underlying operating profit was much closer to 1,447 crore. Still a fantastic, robust operational number, but certainly not a miraculous 539% growth engine. Anyone buying the stock purely based on that headline growth number, assuming the trajectory continues linearly, is fundamentally misreading the income statement.
So what does this all mean for you when you're evaluating a turnaround story? It means you have to dig deeper than the headlines. You have to ignore the distorted PE ratio, and you have to aggressively strip out one-time accounting tricks, like deferred tax assets, to find the real operational pulse. But the source points out one ultimate, undeniable metric that tells the true story of whether a heavy manufacturing turnaround is actually working: return on capital employed, or ROCE.
Yes, ROCE is the ultimate truth teller, the polygraph test for a heavy infrastructure business. Building turbines requires sprawling physical plants, massive piles of raw inventory, enormous receivables tied up with developers, and heavy equipment for the 20,000 megawatt O&M business.
That's a lot of tied-up cash.
That is a tremendous amount of capital tied up to run the machine. ROCE measures how efficiently management is squeezing profit out of every rupee trapped in that massive physical footprint. Back when they were suffocating under debt and their factories were sitting idle, this return metric was structurally broken. Now, as they have shed the unproductive assets, cleaned up the balance sheet, and their underlying earnings rebound, their returns on capital have been steadily, mechanically climbing back. Watching the upward trajectory of that return on capital employed over the next few quarters is the only real way to know if management's story of operating leverage is actually materializing.
Operating leverage. We've thrown that term around, but let's define the mechanics of it, because it is the entire basis of management's future projections.
Operating leverage is the mathematical beauty of scaling a fixed-cost business. Things like factory overhead, corporate headquarters salaries, R&D budgets, and baseline maintenance staff are fixed costs. You have to pay them whether your factory builds 10 turbines a month or 100 turbines a month. Those costs do not scale up linearly just because your top-line revenue is climbing.
So as Suzlon scales up its actual turbine deliveries from, say, 1.5 gigawatts a year toward 2.5 gigawatts and beyond, the revenue surges. But those heavy baseline fixed expenses stay relatively flat. They get absorbed by a much larger pool of incoming cash.
Exactly. Which means once you cross your break-in threshold, every extra incremental turbine they sell drops significantly more pure profit to the bottom line than the turbine before it. That is operating leverage in action, causing profit margins to mechanically expand as volume increases. And Suzlon's management is banking heavily on this exact dynamic. They are guiding the market for 3,800 crore rupees in EBITDA for FY27. If they can hold that 17% operational margin on an expanding revenue base and push physical deliveries toward the 3 gigawatt mark, the math of operating leverage will carry them right to that 3,800 crore target.
So the financial house, after a decade of chaos, is finally in order. Which brings us to a huge transitional point for the company's culture. Tulsi Tanti, the larger-than-life founder who built the empire and lived through the crash, tragically passed away in October 2022. Today, the executive team is led by CEO JP Chalasani, and they are playing a very different, much more grounded game.
They're playing a much less glamorous, but fundamentally more vital game for this stage of the company's life. Chalasani's team does not need to sell a grand global vision. They don't need to stand in Hamburg and announce billion-euro acquisitions. They just need to prove they can reliably build and deliver the physical machines in India.
They just need to execute.
The market is rigorously tracking their specific granular promises. Can you actually hit 2.4 to 2.5 gigawatts of deliveries in FY26? Can you rigidly hold that 17% margin? Trust in institutional markets isn't built on sweeping founder narratives. It is built entirely on a management team's batting average, comparing what they promised in Q1 against what they actually delivered in Q4.
And so far, they are hitting their stride. But as they guide for that massive 3,800 crore EBITDA in FY27, they face external macroeconomic threats that money and good accounting cannot instantly solve. This is where the rubber meets the road. Because even if Suzlon does everything perfectly inside their factory walls, even if their operating leverage works flawlessly, they're entirely, completely dependent on the physical infrastructure and bureaucratic machinery of India.
And that is exactly where the real bottleneck lies. To understand the risk, let's look at India's macro energy goals, because the sheer scale is staggering. India officially pushed its non-fossil fuel capacity past the 50% mark in June 2025.
Which is incredible because they hit that milestone 5 full years ahead of their original schedule.
It is a massive diplomatic and engineering achievement. But hitting that early milestone sets a terrifying expectation for the future. The country has now doubled down, aiming for an absurd target of 500 gigawatts of non-fossil capacity by 2030.
Wow.
To put that in perspective, they are trying to scale up from roughly 220 gigawatts today.
Yeah.
They are trying to build more than they currently have in just a few years.
To hit that 500 gigawatt target,
Right.
what does the wind sector specifically have to pull off?
Wind power essentially needs to double. It has to grow from its current cumulative base of roughly 52.68 gigawatts to a full 100 gigawatts by the end of the decade. That requires adding roughly 47 gigawatts of fresh operational capacity over the next 4 years.
Let me do the basic math on that. That means the country has to add 10 to 12 gigawatts of wind power to the grid every single year.
Correct.
And how much did the entire Indian wind sector actually manage to add in 2025?
Just 5.82 gigawatts.
Oh my. So they have to instantly and miraculously double their entire national installation pace
Yeah.
and sustain that doubled pace for 4 consecutive years.
Exactly. The gap between the speed the country is currently moving and the speed it theoretically needs to move is massive. And closing that gap is simply not something Suzlon can do alone, no matter how efficient their factories are. Accelerating from 5 to 10 gigawatts a year requires government ministries to massively accelerate their auction pipelines. It requires state distribution companies to honor their purchase agreements. It requires navigating India's notoriously complex land acquisition laws to secure sites for these massive machines. And crucially, it requires the physical high-voltage transmission grid to actually be able to handle the massive influx of intermittent power.
Right, because the source notes that Suzlon is currently sitting on a 6.4 gigawatt order book, which, if you read the headline, sounds fantastic. That massive backlog gives them clear revenue visibility well into FY27 and FY28. But an order book is just a piece of paper if the developer can't physically plug the finished turbine into the grid.
This raises an important question. What happens to Suzlon's balance sheet when the national infrastructure isn't ready? The central government has announced a massive 2,044,000 crore rupee investment plan for new transmission lines, which is absolutely necessary. But allocating funds is one thing. Building physical high-voltage transmission towers across thousands of kilometers of rural India takes years of permitting and construction.
They're way behind.
Right now, the existing power corridors in the heaviest wind-producing states, Rajasthan, Gujarat, and Tamil Nadu, are already choked to near absolute capacity.
So let's trace the domino effect. What happens to Suzlon if a mega buyer like Adani Green wins a government contract, orders 100 turbines from Suzlon, but then the grid connection in Gujarat gets delayed by the state government for a year?
It creates a massive, cascading financial failure that backs up right onto Suzlon's balance sheet. Remember that brutal 12 to 18-month manufacturing slog we talked about? Suzlon has already spent massive amounts of their own working capital buying the raw steel, the fiberglass, and the precision gearbox components they build the nacelle.
Yeah.
But if the developer can't get the grid connectivity finalized, the entire project timeline collapses. The developer tells Suzlon to hold off. Suzlon can't deliver the turbine, which means they can't hit their contractual delivery milestone, which means they can't recognize the revenue on their income statement, and more importantly, they can't get paid the cash.
So all that working capital they spent 9 months ago on raw steel just sits stranded in an inventory yard, tying up their liquidity.
Exactly. And if that bottleneck happens at scale, across multiple massive projects simultaneously because a state's grid is overwhelmed, it starts aggressively eating into Suzlon's hard-won net cash position. But grid congestion isn't even the deepest structural flaw they face. The ultimate bottleneck, the rot at the foundation of the Indian power sector, is the financial health of the state distribution companies, universally referred to as the DISCOMs.
Why are the discoms such a chronic problem? I read about discom bailouts constantly.
Because they sit at the intersection of infrastructure and localized politics. DISCOMs are the state-level entities that buy the bulk electricity from the generators and sell it to end consumers. But state governments frequently use electricity pricing as a political tool, offering heavily subsidized or even free electricity to certain voting blocs, particularly in agriculture.
Which bankrupts some.
This chronically bankrupts the DISCOMs. Because they're operating at massive losses, they have a notorious decades-long history of simply paying the power generators late. They take the electricity, but they drag their feet on settling the invoices for months or even years.
And how does that affect a manufacturer like Suzlon? Suzlon doesn't sell power to the discoms, they sell machines to the developers.
It's a vicious cycle of illiquidity. The late payments directly starve the independent power producers, the Adani Greens or Torrent Powers of the world of cash. And if the power producers aren't getting paid their lawful revenue by the state, their cash flows tighten, and they're completely crippled in their ability to promptly pay equipment manufacturers like Suzlon for new turbines. The illiquidity rolls downhill.
The source does mention that the central government has tried to step in recently with late payment surcharges and revamped liquidity schemes, which has helped clear some of the legacy arrears, but the underlying structural issue isn't permanently fixed. So as an investor or just an analyst watching this massive infrastructure transition, how do you track this risk? You obviously can't just trust the glossy news headlines about government capacity targets.
No, you absolutely cannot. Government targets tell you what they want to happen, not what is actually happening.
The source gives you the ultimate hack. If you really want to know if the state companies are actually paying their bills, and if the wind sector's financial plumbing is healthy, you skip the government press releases completely. You look directly at one specific line item on Suzlon's quarterly balance sheet, the receivables cycle.
That is brilliant, highly actionable advice from the author. The receivable cycle, often measured in days sales outstanding, measures exactly how long it takes Suzlon to actually collect hard cash after they bill a customer. That single metric is the absolute, unvarnished truth of the market. If that number starts stretching out, if it goes from 90 days to 120 days to 150 days, it means the entire ecosystem is choking on delayed payments, regardless of what the enthusiastic political speeches say.
It is the pulse of the entire industry's liquidity. Okay, let's pull all this together. The journey of Suzlon Energy is legitimately one of the most incredible corporate sagas in modern emerging markets. From the absolute peak of global debt-fueled hubris in Hamburg in 2007, plunging into the suffocating existential depths of 13,000 crore in structural debt, to systematically stripping away its global empire, retreating home to rely on the government's ALMM supply chain moat, and finally emerging today with a clean balance sheet, a net cash position, and a highly profitable dual-engine business model powered by heavy manufacturing and those 20-year O&M contracts.
It is a textbook, almost unprecedented example of survival through radical, painful corporate restructuring. But as the author makes crystal clear, the era of sweeping global narratives is dead. The era of just surviving the creditors is over. We have entered the era of the execution test. FY27 is the ultimate proving ground. The stock price no longer reflects a turnaround, it reflects an expectation of flawless execution.
No more excuses.
Exactly. It is simply about whether JP Chalasani and his operational team can navigate choked state grids, handle the aggressive pricing expansion of Inox Wind, and physically deliver 3 gigawatts of massive machines without letting their hard-fought 17% margin discipline slip.
Exactly. You can't accurately answer the valuation question until you answer the execution question. And the truth about their execution won't be found by staring at today's massive 6.4 gigawatt order book. It will only be answered in the grueling physical reality of the upcoming FY27 quarterly results. You've got to rigorously watch the return on capital employed, you've got to watch the receivable cycle for signs of discom stress, and you absolutely must ignore the distorted headline PE ratios and one-time accounting bumps.
That is exactly how you look past the noise and read this infrastructure market like a pro.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final lingering thought. We spent a lot of time today talking about that hidden gem of a business, the operations and maintenance contracts. The fact that Suzlon currently manages over 20,000 megawatts of cumulative capacity, servicing machines that have 15 to 20-year lifespans. Think about the physical reality of this. Suzlon is currently planting thousands of massive, heavy steel and fiberglass beasts into the ground every single year to hit these 2030 targets. And they are already managing tens of thousands of aging first-generation turbines across the country. When these massive physical assets inevitably reach the end of their 20-year structural lifespan, what happens to them? Who pays for the decommissioning? Because fiberglass composite doesn't just melt down easily like steel. Could the physical scrap, the incredibly complex chemical recycling of those massive 60-meter fiberglass blades, and the total replacement of these towering machines become a massive, hidden, multi-billion-dollar industrial sector of its own over the next decade? It's something to keep a close eye on as this first wave of renewable infrastructure begins to age out. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Suzlon Energy and the mechanics of the wind. Keep digging into the balance sheets, keep questioning the headlines, and we will see you next time.